It's August 5th, 1999, in Hedrum, a rural area just outside the town of Larvik in southern Norway. Summer is in full swing. 12-year-old Kristin Juel Johannessen is like any other child enjoying her school break. That Thursday evening, around 6:30 p.m., she hops on her bicycle, headed to a nearby lake called Goksjø, where she plans to meet a friend for a swim. She's wearing her swimsuit under her clothes and looking forward to a fun, warm evening by the water. As Kristin pedals down the quiet country road, she unexpectedly crosses paths with her older sister, Linda. Linda is driving home from work and spots Kristin on her bike. They smile and wave to each other in passing. Neither could imagine it would be their final moment together. This is the story of a murder that haunted a rural Norwegian community for 17 years, of a case that was solved, then unraveled, then solved again, and of how a grieving family's persistence finally uncovered the truth. Kristin continues on her way. A little while later, back at home, Linda realizes something. Kristin had borrowed Linda's shoes without asking. It's the kind of trivial sibling offense that usually leads to a playful scolding. Wanting her shoes back, and perhaps to give her little sister a hard time, Linda gets in the car and drives toward the lake to catch up with Kristin. When Linda reaches Kristin's friend's house by the lake, her little sister is nowhere to be found. Kristin never showed up for the swimming date. Concern sets in quickly. It's not like Kristin to just disappear or blow off plans without telling anyone. As minutes tick by, Linda's worry deepens. She starts searching the route, calling out for Kristin, and when there's still no sign of her, the family swings into action. By around 9 p.m. that night, Kristin's family has reported her missing. Word spreads fast in the small community of Østre Hedrum. Neighbors and friends pour out of their homes to help search the area. They fan out along country lanes, through fields and wooded patches, calling Kristin's name into the dusk. Flashlights beam through the gathering darkness as concern grows with each passing minute. Local police respond quickly. Soon officers are on the scene coordinating the search effort. 2 men from the village make a critical discovery. Kristin's bike, discarded on the side of a path. The bike is found near a place called Mørk, a small cluster of farms and forest in Hedrum. Finding the bike without Kristin raises alarm. It suggests she may have been forced off the road or willingly stepped away from her bicycle, which is very unlike her. Police bring in a K9 unit. A search dog is led to the spot where the bike was found, hoping to track Kristin's scent into the woods. Linda, Kristin's sister, is right alongside the officers when they confirm the bicycle is indeed her sister's. It's a chilling confirmation that something is very wrong. Officers gently escort Linda back to the road, asking all civilian searchers to leave the immediate area. At this point, they fear they might be dealing with more than a lost child. They fear a crime has occurred. The summer night deepens. Around 11:30 p.m., just before midnight, police make a heartbreaking discovery. In a wooded thicket not far from where the bicycle was found, they find Kristin. She is lying on the ground in the brush near a gravel road, her small body still. Tragically, Kristin Juel Johannessen is dead. Her life has been violently cut short on what should have been a carefree bike ride. Investigators from Kripos, Norway's National Criminal Investigation Service, are immediately called in to assist. The area is treated as a crime scene and cordoned off. Officers note that some of Kristin's clothing is disturbed. Notably, her bathing suit has been cut. There are signs of a struggle, broken vegetation, disturbed earth, indicating Kristin fought bravely for her life. Later, the autopsy will confirm the cause of death: strangulation. Kristin had been choked to death and left just out of sight of the road. One early fear can be put to rest. Despite initial media speculation, Kristin was not sexually assaulted. The police publicly refute rumors of sexual abuse, making it clear that apart from the violent act of murder itself, there's no evidence Kristin was raped or molested. However, the fact that her swimsuit strap was cut suggests a possible sexual motive that was never carried out. Perhaps her attacker intended to assault her. and Kristin's fierce resistance foiled that plan. We can only infer from the evidence, as the perpetrator's true intent was never conclusively determined in court. For the tight-knit community around Hedrum, the discovery of Kristin's murder is shattering. This peaceful rural area, where families knew each other and children played outside without worry, is suddenly the site of a heinous crime. A 12-year-old girl killed on her way to meet a friend. It's the kind of nightmare that just doesn't happen there, until it did. The days after Kristin's murder are filled with anguish and confusion. Her family, Mother Anne, Father Roar, Sister Linda, are plunged into grief. The whole town mourns the loss of a bright, active girl who was known for her love of animals and sports. Photos of Kristin with her beloved dogs appear in the news, making the tragedy even more poignant. It's hard to fathom who could harm this innocent girl on a sunny summer evening. The media descends on Hedrum. The case immediately grabs national attention in Norway, dominating headlines. Journalists scramble for any detail about the crime, the investigation, the family. The coverage is so intense that it verges on intrusive. Reporters and camera crews even attempt to approach the Johannessen family's home directly. Family friends take an extraordinary step to protect them. They block the road leading to the house and set up a sort of checkpoint, ensuring no uninvited press sneak through. This impromptu barrier becomes known derisively as the tent of shame, a sign of how relentless the media pursuit was. A later report would slam the media for the frenzied coverage and invasion of the family's privacy. In the midst of unimaginable loss, the Johannessens also had to endure being under a microscope. Meanwhile, police investigators are under enormous pressure to find Kristin's killer. For the local Larvik police and assisting Kripos detectives, this is priority number one. Tips begin to flood in from the public. People report anyone in the area that evening who seemed suspicious. One early lead captures investigators' attention. Multiple witnesses recall seeing a man on a motorbike near the time and place Kristin disappeared. In fact, police had put out a public alert shortly after the murder, asking for information about a motorbike rider seen in the vicinity. This individual, dubbed Lågendalsmannen, the Lågendal Valley Man, in the press, becomes the first major person of interest. The description is vague, just a man on a small motorcycle. But in a rural community, a stranger, or even a local doing that at dinner time might stand out. Investigators work to track down anyone in Hedrum who owns a motorbike or might match the reports. Within a week of the murder, police make their first arrest. The suspect is a local man in his 50s, who reportedly was seen riding a motorbike through the area on the day Kristin was killed. Later reports suggest this man was mentally disabled or had some intellectual challenges. He was known in the community as a quiet, perhaps eccentric individual, someone who might easily draw suspicion in a fearful atmosphere. On August 12, 1999, just 7 days after Kristin's death, this 54-year-old man is arrested and charged with her murder. It's a bold move by law enforcement so early in the investigation. They must have felt there was a plausible case, eyewitnesses placing him near the scene, and perhaps something more. The public, desperate for answers, learns of the arrest through breathless news reports. For a moment, it seems like the mystery might have been solved almost as quickly as it began. However, as the weeks turn into months, the case against the so-called motorbike man falters. The exact evidence against him was never made fully public, but clearly it wasn't enough to hold up. There were likely no forensic ties, no DNA, fingerprints, or hair linking him to Kristin. Possibly the man had an alibi or the timeline didn't quite fit. After holding him in custody for around 3 months, authorities quietly dropped the charges and release him. He was cleared of suspicion, officially acquitted of any wrongdoing in Kristin's case. This first suspect's ordeal illustrates a tragic pattern in many high-profile cases. Intense pressure to find someone can lead to the wrong person. In fact, he later received 700,000 Norwegian kroner, about $80,000, as compensation for the wrongful accusation and time spent in custody. The local papers reported the man's relief and vindication when the compensation was awarded. He cheered at the news, finally free from the shadow of suspicion. For the investigators, though, this was a major setback. Weeks of precious time had been spent focused on the wrong man, while the real killer remained at large. The community's relief turned back to anxiety. If not the motorbike rider, then who? Was there a predatory stranger in their midst? The police had to essentially start over, combing through evidence and tips anew. As 1999 turned to 2000, Kristin's case was still open and active. The pressure on the police only mounted, not just from the public and media, but from within. Detectives felt personally invested in solving this brutal crime. One of them was Jørn Lier Horst, an investigator with the Larvik police, and who would later become a well-known crime novelist. Horst would later describe Kristin's case as one that gave him long, sleepless nights. It was the kind of case that an investigator goes over time and time again, scrutinizing every detail for something missed. He was determined, as were all his colleagues, to catch whoever did this to Kristin. With the wrong man cleared, the team looked to another man who was seen by witnesses acting suspiciously on a motorbike near where Kristin was last spotted. 23-year-old local Henning Hotvedt. Hotvedt told investigators that at the time of the murder he was at home using his computer. However, when police arrived to examine the device for evidence, they found it disassembled and the hard drive erased. Hotvedt explained that he had deleted the data because he was planning to take the computer in for service. But authorities viewed this as suspicious, as it destroyed potential evidence that could have supported his alibi. Investigators then turned to physical evidence to support their belief that Hotvedt was the perpetrator. During Kristin's autopsy, several hairs had been found on her body and clothing. At least one strand of hair was recovered from Kristin's shoulder or near her, and forensic analysts had been examining it. By May 2000, about 9 months after the murder, the forensic lab results came back. Investigators believed they had a match. The hair, they thought, matched their new suspect. Hotvedt wasn't in the area anymore. He had left Norway and was living in neighbouring Sweden. In fact, Detective Horst was tasked with tracking this lead, and he followed the trail all the way to Stockholm. By the time of his arrest he was 24, which fits the timeline of a May 2000 indictment. So who was Henning Hotvedt? He was a young man who, on the surface, didn't necessarily fit the image of a murderer. Back in 1999, Hotvedt had been going through a rough patch. He'd recently gone through a breakup, was reportedly depressed, and even lost his job around that time. After these personal setbacks, he apparently left Norway and went to Sweden, perhaps for work or a fresh start. This move might have looked suspicious to police after Kristin's murder. Did he leave to avoid questioning? The Norwegian authorities coordinated with Swedish police to apprehend Hotvedt. His arrest in Stockholm was a major development. Soon after, in May 2000, Henning Hotvedt was officially charged with Kristin's murder. Extradited back to Norway, Hotvedt would face trial the next year. At this point, the case seemed to be heading toward resolution in court. Investigators had built a case, and prosecutors were confident enough to take it forward. It's important to note that in the year 2000, forensic science was making strides, but wasn't as advanced as today. DNA profiling existed, but retrieving DNA from certain evidence, like hair, was not always possible unless the hair had the root attached. Instead, microscopic hair analysis was commonly used, comparing hair strands by appearance under a microscope. Such analysis could suggest a match, but wasn't nearly as definitive as DNA. In this case, the hair from the scene was believed to match Hotvedt's by whatever methods were available. That evidence would become the linchpin of the prosecution's case against him. At the time, microscopic hair comparison was widely accepted in courts worldwide, though it would later face serious scrutiny. The technique relied on forensic experts examining various characteristics of hair samples under powerful microscopes, looking for similarities in features like pigmentation, scale patterns, and internal structures. While it seemed scientific and convincing to juries, the method was fundamentally subjective and, as would later be revealed, prone to error. Many wrongful convictions in various countries would eventually be traced back to overstated hair comparison evidence, but in 2000 to 2001, it was still considered a valid forensic tool, and expert testimony about hair matches carried significant weight in criminal trials. In October 2001, just over 2 years after Kristin's death, Henning Hotvedt went on trial in the Larvik District Court, Herredsret. Hotvet, now 25, walked into the courtroom to face the gravest of accusations, that he had murdered 12-year-old Kristin Juel Johannessen. The trial was closely followed by the Norwegian public. This was a huge case, one of the most talked about crimes in the country at the time. Kristin's family sat through the proceedings, hoping to see the man responsible for their daughter's death finally held accountable. From the start, Hotvet insisted on his innocence. He pleaded not guilty and showed no signs of wavering in that claim. The prosecution, led by State Attorney Petter Sørdal, laid out their evidence. The hair found on Kristin was front and center. Forensic experts testified that this hair was microscopically consistent with Hotvet's. In 2001, a definitive DNA test on that hair was not presented, likely because at that time they hadn't been able to extract or analyze its DNA. Instead, it was probably an analysis of color, length, medulla pattern, etc. that linked it to Hotvet. It was portrayed as a crucial clue. How else would a hair with the same characteristics as Henning Hotvet's be on Kristin's body unless he was the killer? The prosecution also discussed Hotvet's lack of alibi for that evening and his suspicious behavior in dismantling his computer. What's more, several witnesses recalled seeing him near the crime scene and feeling as if he was following them. A woman testified how she had been frightened of a man matching Hotvet's description that repeatedly drove past her as she cycled home, continually stopping in front of her and walking along the road. She thought it was really creepy. She felt like he had been waiting for her, said the prosecutor. The woman identified the Logendalsmannen as the defendant, Henning Hotvet. She picked him out for a photo lineup twice. When the police asked her if she was sure, she said, "I'm as sure as can be." Another damning piece of circumstantial evidence came from a friend of the defendant, who recalled that days after the murder, Hotvet confided that he had done something so bad that it was unforgivable, according to prosecutors. Hotvet's defense attorney at the time was Tor Kjærvik, a respected lawyer who was himself tragically murdered in 2021. Kjærvik's strategy was to cast doubt on the evidence and present Hotvet as someone incapable of such a crime. One interesting aspect brought up in trial was Hotvet's military service, or lack thereof. He had avoided Norway's mandatory military duty by applying for an exemption, claiming he had a conscientious objection to taking lives. In court, the prosecutor suggested Hotvet manipulated the system to dodge service. Hotvet admitted he basically gamed the application, which undercut his credibility when he insisted he was innocent now. Another angle discussed was Hotvet's mental state around the time of the murder. Prosecutors tried to depict him as depressed and unstable after his breakup in mid-1999, perhaps suggesting a motive or at least a condition where he might snap. Hotvet, however, pushed back on that. He testified that by August 1999, he had gotten over the heartbreak, denying any psychological imbalance. A psychiatric evaluation found no sign that Hotvet had any mental illness or intellectual impairment at the time of the crime. In other words, he was deemed sane and responsible for his actions, if indeed he did them. Kristin's family had to endure hearing the details of their daughter's death relived in court, but they also gave voice to their loss. During the sentencing phase, Roar Juel Johannessen, Kristin's father, took the stand to describe what the family had suffered. He spoke of how everything changed on August 5th, 1999, how their once normal, happy family life was shattered in an instant. Linda, Kristin's sister, experienced severe trauma, even going into a kind of shock in the days after the murder. The family felt let down by inadequate support in the aftermath. Roar recounted how they struggled to get timely psychological help for Linda and themselves in those critical days. The murder destroyed their sense of safety and normalcy. Roar also shared a poignant moment that occurred shortly after Kristin's death. He described standing over Kristin's coffin in the chapel, looking at his little girl one last time. In that heart-rending moment, he made a promise, both to himself and to Kristin. He stood beside her and said, "I'll take the bastard who killed her, whatever the cost will be." Kristin had always been a trustworthy girl, he said. If she made a promise, she kept it. so he vowed to keep his promise in return, to find her killer and see justice done. After an emotional trial, the verdict came in 2001. Henning Hotvedt was found guilty of the murder of Kristin Juel Johannessen. He was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison by the Larvik court. For context, in Norway at that time, 12 years was a significant sentence. The maximum for murder was around 21 years, though sentences are often shorter due to various factors. The Johannessen family felt some vindication. They had fought to get to this point, and now, at least on paper, Kristin's killer was held responsible. As they left the court, Roar said to reporters, "It feels strange now, but this is what we have fought for all these years. Now we're finished with this. It was the last day in court, but we'll never be finished with Kristin." It seemed that justice had been done. However, this case was about to take another dramatic turn. The story was far from over. Henning Hotvedt's conviction in 2001 was not the end of the legal road. In Norway, as in many countries, a defendant convicted in a lower court has the right to appeal. Hotvedt maintained his innocence adamantly, so naturally he appealed the verdict to a higher court. Sometime in 2002, his case was due to be heard by the Borgarting Court of Appeal. And this is where things took an unexpected twist. During the appeal process, new forensic testing was done on the critical hair evidence, this time employing a more advanced technique. By 2002, DNA analysis methods had improved even in the short time since the trial. Scientists attempted to extract a DNA profile from that strand of hair found on Kristin's shoulder. They succeeded enough to get a determination, and the result was shocking. The hair did not come from Henning Hotvedt at all. It came from a female. This revelation blew the prosecution's case apart. The crucial strand of hair that had been presented as Hotvedt's turned out to be completely unrelated to him. It likely either belonged to Kristin herself, or perhaps to a female rescuer or officer who inadvertently dropped it. In any case, it was a catastrophic error in the initial forensic work. The very foundation of Hotvedt's conviction was now in doubt. Upon this finding, the authorities had no choice but to concede that the evidence was insufficient. In 2003, before the full appeal trial even took place, Henning Hotvedt was acquitted. The appeals court overturned his conviction, essentially due to the new DNA evidence that undermined the state's case. Hotvedt, who had spent time in prison during the trial and appeal process, was released and cleared of the charges. For Kristin's family, this was a devastating development. In their eyes, they were back to square one. Their daughter's murderer was yet again walking free. Roar Johannessen was blunt about his disappointment. "It was a huge letdown. Our family life was put on hold," he said of the moment in 2003 when Hotvedt was acquitted. All the pain of the murder was compounded by the pain of uncertainty and the prospect that justice hadn't really been done after all. Legally, Hotvedt was now a free man and not guilty in the eyes of the law. He even applied for and received compensation for his ordeal, around 500,000 kroner, approximately $60,000, for having been wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. Imagine the Johannessens' frustration. Not only was the man they believed killed Kristin out of prison, but the state was paying him for the mistake. It was salt in the wound. However, the police and prosecutors still had lingering suspicions about Hotvedt. Acquittal doesn't necessarily mean exoneration. It often means there wasn't enough evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And indeed, Hotvedt's acquittal did not identify any alternative suspect. It just poked a gaping hole in the case. Officially, Kristin's murder returned to unsolved status, a cold case in the making. For many families in this situation, that might have been the tragic end. An unsolved case, a prime suspect acquitted, nowhere left to turn. But not for Roar Juel Johannessen. Remember his promise at Kristin's coffin. He was not going to break it. If anything, this legal twist steeled his resolve to keep fighting for Kristin. After the acquittal in 2003, Kristin's case went cold from the police perspective. But it burned hotter than ever in Roar's heart. He simply refused to let it go. In fact, Raw effectively became an investigator himself. He asked a prominent lawyer, John Christian Eldon, to help him get access to the case files. This was an unusual request. Normally, confidential investigation files aren't handed over to victims' families. But given the extraordinary situation, Eldon managed to secure a copy of the entire police dossier for the Johannessen family in March 2003. Raw said he didn't know what I was in for, but God help me, it was a lot of work. Raw, his wife Anne, and a close neighbour friend named Elizabeth Stock set about poring over every detail of the case. They spread out binders of reports and photos on their dining table, turning their home into a makeshift detective's office. Their goal, Raw said, was to figure out what the police had missed. They were convinced that somewhere in those pages was the key to solving Kristin's murder. Perhaps a clue was overlooked or a witness not fully pursued. This kind of dogged persistence is rare, but it does happen in some cold cases, where family members essentially become part of the investigative process. In doing so, Raw actually collaborated at times with the former lead detective, Jørn Lear Horst, who had since left the police to become a writer. Horst and Raw stayed in touch. Over the years, Horst gave Raw advice and even entertained unconventional leads, including tips from clairvoyance. It shows the lengths to which Raw was willing to go. No stone would be left unturned, even the mystical ones. Raw's tireless work actually generated new tips. For instance, he uncovered that there were unidentified fingerprints in the case, prints found at the scene or on Kristin's belongings that hadn't matched anyone known. It's not clear if those prints ever matched Hotvet or anyone else, but they were part of the unsolved puzzle. Raw would periodically take what he found and go back to the police, urging them to follow up. To the police's credit, they didn't completely shelve the case. Cold case reviews were done every so often, especially as forensic technology advanced. Kristin's murder was often mentioned in the same breath as other child murder cases in Scandinavia. Each high-profile incident would spur the question, could Kristin's killer still be out there? And could new technology finally catch him? Raw certainly believed so. Year after year, he kept the faith. He had promised Kristin he'd get the one who did it, and he meant to keep that promise whatever the cost. This personal mission carried the family through very dark times. It also put some strain on them. Raw admitted he became obsessed with solving the case. Counselors even advised him at one point to try to let it go for the sake of his own mental health, but he couldn't do that. Giving up was not an option. And so the years rolled on. 2004, 2005, 2006. Kristin's absence at birthdays, holidays, and daily life remained a constant ache for her family. A generation of kids in Larvik grew up hearing about Kristin's murder as a cautionary tale. Yet, despite the passage of time, Raw and Anne Johannessen kept hope alive that one day they would know the truth. By 2014, 15 years had passed since Kristin's death. Forensic science had leapt light years ahead of where it was in 1999 or even 2003. Techniques like touch DNA analysis and far more sensitive equipment were now available. Old evidence from cold cases was being re-examined worldwide, and many decades-old murders were finally being solved. The Norwegian police had established a cold case unit to look into unsolved crimes. Kristin's case was exactly the kind of case they would tackle. High profile, with preserved evidence that might yield new clues. A critical piece of evidence from Kristin's autopsy had been kept safe all these years. Kristin's fingernails. During the autopsy in 1999, the medical examiner had scraped under her nails for any foreign material, as is standard procedure. Victims of strangulation sometimes claw at their assailant, potentially catching the assailant's skin cells or blood under their nails. In 1999, the technology wasn't there to do much with a few cells that might be under a girl's nails, especially if the sample was degraded. But by 2014 to 2015, it was very much possible. At Raw's urging, and with cold case investigators on board, authorities decided to retest the evidence from Kristin's case. New DNA analysis methods were applied, focusing especially on those nail scrapings and any other preserved traces. And then, A breakthrough. Scientists managed to develop a DNA profile from material under Kristin's fingernails. This was a monumental moment. After so many years, Kristin herself may have trapped her killer's genetic fingerprint as she fought back. When they ran the DNA profile through databases, it matched none other than Henning Hotvedt. In fact, it specifically matched Hotvedt's DNA, which the police presumably had on file from the earlier investigation. This was the evidence investigators had needed all along. The odds of someone else coincidentally having the same DNA under her nails were astronomical. Barring contamination, or an astounding coincidence, this was essentially proof that Hotvedt had been in direct contact with Kristin during the struggle that led to her death. One of the officers who'd been deeply involved originally, Jørn Lea Horst, got a phone call about the development. It was from Raw, of course. On a Wednesday morning in July 2015, Raw called Horst and said the words he'd been waiting 15 years to say. The police had arrested a man for Kristin's murder. And not just any man, the same man they had apprehended 15 years earlier. It was Hotvedt, back in custody. Think about that for a second. In 2001, the case against Hotvedt was built on a hair that turned out not to be his. Now, the case was built on his actual DNA found on Kristin herself, which is infinitely more damning. It's tragic that the technology or foresight didn't allow testing of the nail evidence earlier. It could have saved years of uncertainty. But at least now they had it. On July 9th, 2015, police publicly announced that they had arrested a suspect in Kristin's case. Though they initially didn't name him, it was quickly confirmed to be the same man who'd been convicted and then acquitted all those years ago. Henning Hotvedt, now 38. The news made headlines across Norway. For a case that many thought was long dormant, this was a stunning resurrection. Kristin's parents reacted with a mix of relief and wariness. They had been here before. The system had failed once. It could fail again. Roar Johannessen met with the police after the arrest and delivered a frank message. "I hope you're doing the right thing now. This is the third time you're going to court, and now there is no room for error. Now you must know what you're doing." One can understand his sentiment. This had to be done correctly, by the book, with no shortcuts or overconfidence. They finally had what looked like concrete evidence, and they couldn't afford to bungle it. Kristin's mother, Anne, speaking to the press that week, said, "One can never be completely sure before there's a verdict. Now we sincerely hope that we will soon have peace." She had quietly endured 16 years of agony and was cautiously optimistic that closure might finally be within reach. The legal situation in 2015 was highly unusual. Henning Hotvedt had been acquitted in 2003. Normally, the principle of double jeopardy prevents someone from being tried twice for the same crime after acquittal. However, Norway has an exception. If new, compelling evidence emerges, a case can be reopened even after an acquittal, especially for serious crimes like murder. This is handled by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. Indeed, the police submitted the new DNA evidence and their request to this commission, and on March 17, 2016, the commission announced the case would be reopened, the first time in Norway that a murder case was retried after an acquittal. So, legally, they vacated the old acquittal and essentially reset the case for a new trial. It's worth noting how significant that is. It shows just how strong the new evidence was perceived to be, because courts do not take retrying an acquitted person lightly. Hotvedt's defense attorneys certainly objected, but the process moved forward. Upon his rearrest in 2015, Hotvedt was held in custody as he awaited the new trial. Prosecutors were careful to lock everything down. At his initial remand hearing, they requested closed doors, no press allowed, because they feared Hotvedt might try to destroy evidence if he learned all the details of what they had. One report mentioned that he had refused to give police access to some data they wanted to examine. In any event, by mid-2015, Hotvedt was back behind bars, awaiting the second major courtroom showdown of his life. In August 2016, the new trial of Henning Hotvedt for the murder of Kristin Juel Johannessen began, this time in the Borgarting Court of Appeal in Oslo. Because this was a retrial after an acquittal, the case was heard directly at the appeals court level, but functionally, it was like a full trial with witnesses, evidence presentation, and crucially, a jury deciding the facts. Norway still used lay juries in the appeal courts for serious crimes until 2017, and this was one of the last cases with a jury system. The atmosphere was tense. Over 17 years had passed since the crime. Hotvet was now 40 years old, almost twice the age he was when Kristin was killed. Kristin's family, still bearing the scars of trauma, once again sat in court day after day, listening to the details of their daughter's final moments. This time, the evidence was far more compelling. The crown jewel was, of course, the DNA under Kristin's nails. Forensic experts testified how new technology allowed them to detect male DNA from the material collected under her fingernails, and that DNA profile matched Henning Hotvet with essentially astronomical odds of it being someone else. In fact, one analysis showed that the specific Y chromosome markers found were so rare that only a handful of men in the world would have them, making it extremely likely it was Hotvet's. This wasn't a coincidental hair or a touch that could be explained away innocently. It directly tied him to a violent struggle with Kristin. Prosecutor Johan Overberg presented a clear narrative. On August 5, 1999, Hotvet attacked Kristin as she bicycled along the road. She fought back hard, so hard that she scratched him, getting his DNA under her nails. Enraged or panicked, Hotvet strangled her to death and fled, leaving her body in the woods. In support of this narrative, Overberg highlighted the evidence of a struggle. Broken foliage, items at the scene, and the fact that Kristin's bathing suit had been cut or torn. This last detail suggested Hotvet may have tried to sexually assault Kristin prior to killing her, but notably the prosecution did not charge or argue a sexual motive explicitly. They perhaps felt it unnecessary to prove intent beyond the murder itself, or they weren't 100% certain of a sexual assault attempt since it wasn't completed. However, Overberg did emphasize two aggravating factors: Kristin's age and the brutality of the attack. The fact that Kristin likely endured terror and a fight for her life before she was killed made the crime even more heinous in the state's view. The defense team, now led by advocates Brynjar Melling and Trine Frantzen, had a very difficult task. DNA evidence is hard to refute, especially when the defendant has no legitimate reason to have been in contact with the victim. Hotvet still insisted he had never met Kristin and had nothing to do with her death. So how to explain away the DNA? One strategy could have been to suggest contamination, but apparently nothing concrete was presented that undermined the lab work. The samples had been well preserved. Chain of custody was solid. Instead, the defense focused on legal and procedural appeals for leniency or doubt. They argued that convicting Hotvet so long after the fact raised issues about whether this was a reasonable time for trial under human rights conventions. 17 years is a long time. Was it reasonable? However, the counter-argument was clear. Hotvet did have his trial originally, and it's through his own acquittal and new evidence that we're here now. The delay, while unfortunate, was due to discovering new evidence, not negligence. They also asked for leniency in sentencing due to the time passed and Hotvet's condition. They pointed out that Hotvet's life had been in limbo these many years too, implying maybe a lighter sentence. Additionally, they claimed Hotvet's mental health in 1999 was weakened by depression, as a mitigating factor. This was somewhat ironic given Hotvet's own denial in 2001 of being in any mental distress, but lawyers will use whatever they can to help their client. For Roar and Ann Johannessen, sitting through this trial was both harrowing and vindicating. They heard again about the horror Kristin endured, but now there was vindication that their long-held belief in Hotvet's guilt was backed by hard science. Roar took the stand in this trial too, describing the toll on the family. He recounted how after Hotvet was acquitted in 2003, he nearly went insane with frustration. That's when he got the case files and began his own investigation. He spoke of how keeping his promise to Kristin became an obsession, but also what kept him going. When you get everything from 1999 up to now poured in, you now will fill a void again, Roar said, indicating that the arrest and trial were reopening old wounds. But it's a positive void. The one who sits over there will atone for the damn action he has done. It doesn't give us Kristin back, but... He also movingly repeated the story of how he promised Kristin to catch her killer. Kristin was a girl we trusted and who kept her promises. Then I should also keep what I promised, he said resolutely in court. There was no mistaking the determination and righteous anger in this father's testimony. Other witnesses likely included forensic experts detailing the DNA methods, perhaps old witnesses rehashing the timeline, and character witnesses. It's worth noting one peculiarity. Hotvet's own mother requested to testify behind closed doors because she couldn't handle speaking openly. She might have pleaded for her son's character or explained something about him. We don't know. But it underscores that Hotvet had family who stood by him too, and for them, this was also a painful saga. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. In Norway's system then, the jury didn't give reasons, just a verdict of guilty or not guilty. On September 1st, 2016, the jury delivered its decision, guilty. They unanimously found Henning Hotvet guilty of murdering Kristin Juel Johannessen. The long chase was finally over, or as one crime commentator put it, after 17 years, the hunt is over. A collective sigh of relief swept through Kristin's loved ones and the community that had watched this saga unfold for a generation. One of Norway's most notorious unsolved cases was now solved. The court then had to decide the sentence and financial restitution. The prosecution asked for 13 years in prison, slightly more than the original 12, perhaps factoring in that she was a child and that Hotvet effectively evaded justice for years. The defense argued that so much time had passed that giving a heavy sentence now was almost like punishing him twice. Ultimately, the court sided more with the prosecution. They sentenced Henning Hotvet to 13 years in prison for the murder. Given that by 2016 he was 40, this meant he'd be in his early 50s by release if he served the full term. Additionally, the court ordered Hotvet to pay compensation, damages, to Kristin's family. Roar and Anne sought significant restitution for emotional suffering and economic losses. The mother had developed PTSD and significant health problems as a direct result of losing Kristin. Linda, the sister, also was diagnosed with PTSD. The court recognized these harms. Hotvet was ordered to pay a large sum, though whether he could pay such an amount remained unclear. It was a symbolic victory for the family that the legal system acknowledged their suffering. When the verdict was announced, Hotvet showed little emotion other than fainting briefly upon hearing guilty. He had maintained his innocence to the end, quietly shaking his head at times during the trial. But the evidence spoke louder than his denials. After the conviction, Hotvet's lawyers filed an appeal to Norway's Supreme Court, trying one last time to overturn the verdict or reduce the sentence. They argued procedural issues and the question of reasonable time. However, in February 2017, the Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal. The conviction and sentence stood as final. The long legal saga was conclusively over. For the Johannessen family, the final confirmation of Hotvet's guilt was a bittersweet victory. In the courtroom, Roar and Anne held a photo of Kristin, a smiling girl forever 12, as the verdict was read. They would never get Kristin back, but at least they finally knew with certainty who was responsible and that he was being punished. A prison term can never be enough, Roar said after sentencing, but this is what we have fought for all these years. There was relief that the lengthy criminal process was finally over. They could at last put flowers on Kristin's grave, knowing the promise to her had been kept, her killer unmasked and held accountable. This case had a profound impact in Norway. It highlighted how forensic science advances can change everything in a cold case. If not for the new DNA analysis, Henning Hotvet might have walked free for life, and the mystery of Kristin's death would linger. It's chilling to think that the killer was the same man all along, the initial suspect they zeroed in on after the motorbike man. The police had the right guy in 2000, but because of a forensic error and the limits of technology at the time, he slipped through their fingers. It's a case that underscores both the fallibility of early evidence techniques and the power of modern DNA testing. As one commentator put it, this became one of Norway's most publicized murder cases precisely because of those twists and turns. It also set a legal precedent as the first murder retrial after an acquittal, testing the balance between victims' rights to justice and defendants' rights to finality. The success in Kristin's case likely emboldened authorities to consider reopening other serious cases if new evidence emerges. And what of Henning Hotvedt? To this day, he maintains that he did not kill Kristin. In the face of the evidence, most accept the jury's verdict that he did. We might speculate on his motives. Was he simply a disturbed young man who saw an opportunity to attack a girl because he was angry at life? The cut swimsuit hints at sexual motivation, but we'll never know if that was primary or if it was an opportunistic assault that turned murderous. Hotvedt never confessed or explained. He served his prison time quietly. By now, he may be out or nearing release, having paid his debt in the eyes of the law. But he will forever carry the infamy of what he did, as well as the unusual footnote of having been convicted, acquitted, and convicted again. For Larvik and the community of Hedrum, the conclusion of the case allowed a collective exhale. The children who were Kristin's age in 1999 are adults now, some with kids of their own. The countryside where a family once put up a tent of shame to ward off paparazzi has long since returned to its quiet state. But Kristin's memory endures. She'd be in her mid-30s today, perhaps with a family or career of her own, had fate been kinder. One can't help but reflect on Roy Johannessen's relentless dedication. His vow to Kristin and his refusal to let the case die were instrumental in ultimately achieving justice. It was Roy who prodded and pushed until the system gave the case another look. It was Roy who, through sheer love for his daughter, ensured that Kristin's name was never forgotten or relegated to a cold case file collecting dust. In a sense, it was a father's love that kept the wheels of justice turning when they might have stopped. Thank you so much for listening. If you're intrigued by these types of unheard solved global murder cases, please consider following Murder Without Borders on your favorite podcast app and giving us a 5-star review. It helps us out a lot, and we really appreciate it.